Welcome to the Veritas Podcast, the show where we study and discuss papal writings of the Catholic Church. All right, this is Rob, and he's Rob, and this is the Veritas Podcast. This is episode 3, or part 3 of Libertas. But before we go any further, we thought it would be a good idea for Rob just to kind of catch us up to speed on where we've been and to kind of prepare us for this deep discussion we're about to have. So, Rob, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Yeah, in the first 2 episodes, we were discussing what true liberty is. And first, we distinguished between natural liberty, which is basically free will. It's the ability to make a rational free choice, okay? And we also mentioned moral liberty, which are, you could say, the boundaries for our natural liberty. So natural liberty, you could look at it as what man is able to do, whereas moral liberty is what man is allowed to do. So with my natural liberty, I could do just about anything. I could kill somebody. I could steal something. But moral liberty prevents those. I can only do good with my moral liberty. We also discussed the relationship between the intellect and the will. Man's a rational being, and part of being a rational being is that he has a free will. Free will goes along only with a rational being. So we discussed how the distinction again between the intellect and the will. The will has 2 functions. It desires and it chooses. But the will is a blind faculty, so although it will always desire a good, because good is the object of the will, since it's a blind faculty, it can't discern or distinguish between a true good and a merely perceived good. So it needs something then to direct it in its choice. Remember, the will desires and it chooses. The desires are blind, but it also chooses, but it needs something to direct it in its choice so that it chooses a true good instead of a false good. And that something that directs it in its choice is the intellect. The object of the intellect is true. Okay, the object of the will is the good. The object of the intellect is the true. So the intellect judges the true good, and then it directs the will in its choice. We also mentioned how the intellect and the will are both defective due to the fall. Okay, so both of them are imperfect due to the fall. The imperfection in the will, the defect in the will, is that it will sometimes choose other than what the intellect tells it to choose. So the intellect judges the will, you should choose this. This is the good for you to choose. But the will, it chooses something else. Okay, so that's the defect in the will. The defect in the intellect is that it will sometimes judge wrong. So the intellect will mistakenly judge something that is bad as being good, or it'll mistakenly judge something good to be bad. And then what happens? It then misdirects the will in its choice. So in that case, even if the will does choose what the intellect proposes, which it's supposed to do, it's still defective because the intellect itself chose wrong. So that's the defect in the intellect and the will. The defect in the will, it sometimes chooses other than what the will sometimes chooses other than what the intellect proposes. That's the defect in the will. And the intellect sometimes judges wrong. That's the defect in the intellect.
Yeah, so the intellect
next
can...
paragraphs are coming up here pretty quickly. Leo XIII is going to discuss the things that help to perfect or rectify the defect in both the intellect and the defect in the will. And there's intrinsic things, and there's also extrinsic things. Intrinsic, there's things that are within us that kind of come from us. that help to perfect the intellect and will. And there's extrinsic things, things outside of us that help to perfect the intellect and the will. The intrinsic things are one law, the natural law. We've talked about that. The natural law is a participation in the eternal law of God. So it's God's eternal law, God's eternal reason, stamped upon our created reason, by virtue of which we know right from wrong. So that's one of the things that helps us to do what we ought to do. There's also virtues, and there's natural virtues and supernatural virtues, which are intrinsic to us. Natural virtues, a virtue is a good operative habit. So if you do something repeatedly, a good action, it becomes a habit. And a virtue is in a good operative habit. A supernatural virtue is not something that you acquire by repeated actions like a natural virtue is. A supernatural virtue is infused directly into you by God, and it's also habitual, meaning it abides with you. So the natural virtues within you help you to live according to right reason, and the supernatural virtues also help you to live according to right reason. Those are intrinsic to you. Things that are extrinsic are, for example, law. So if you have a good human law enacted by the authorities, that also helps you to live according to right reason. How? In one way, it helps you to judge right. So if the law reflects what is objectively true and good, it helps your intellect to judge right. All it has to do is accept the good law, and it won't deviate from the truth. So that perfects the intellect. It also, a good just law will also perfect the will, or it will at least be a force to persuade the will to choose the right thing. How does it do that? It does that by sanctions, okay? So there's a law that says do this and don't do that, and that helps your intellect. There's also a penalty. If you do the bad thing, you're going to be punished. And how does that perfect the will? Because the will doesn't want to be punished. The will wants something good. It doesn't want something bad. So the fact that there's sanctions attached to the laws will then induce the will to follow the intellect, to choose what it ought to choose, rather than just follow the blind desires. So this is what he's going to start getting into a little further. So hopefully this initial explanation will help us to kind of grasp what he's discussing in the following paragraphs.
Yeah, I think it's a good summary of the next 8 or so paragraphs. In fact, a lot of that applies. So we'll get into that. So Pope Leo in Libertas number 7 is discussing law and freedom. The Holy Father writes, quote, "Nothing more foolish can be uttered or conceived than the notion that because man is free by nature, he is therefore exempt from law. Were this the case, it would follow that to become free, we must be deprived of reason, whereas the truth is that we are bound to submit to law, precisely because we are free by our very nature. For law is the guide of man's actions. It turns him toward good by its rewards, and deters him from evil by its punishments." End of the quote. We keep coming back to this, Rob. The Holy Father writes that we are free when we use our reason and follow the law. But modernists, when you say believe that freedom is to be above or without the law, they don't want to be bound by our rules, by God's rules and the Church's rules as well. But this, of course, leads to literal chaos in the world, anarchy, but also chaos in one's soul. What do you think?
Right, exactly. See, the liberals, we've talked about it before, they don't understand what true freedom is. They think that freedom is simply doing what you want to do, okay, rather than what they ought to do. So when they see a law that forbids them from doing what they want to do, a law, say, that forbids, say there was a law that forbids pornography, okay, they would consider that a violation of their liberty. Who are you to tell them what they can and cannot do? See, they don't distinguish the objective evil. They just want to do what they want to do And any law that gets in their way is considered a violation of their liberty, and they'll usually call it tyranny. Okay, when someone wants to forbid them from doing what they want to do, that's a tyrannical act because they have this false notion of liberty. But see, when someone gets in the habit of obeying their lower nature, their flesh, instead of obeying their reason, they quickly develop vices and become slaves to their lower nature. So how many people today, for example, are addicted to drugs, or they're enslaved to the vice of impurity? And our society is saturated with impurity. And once a person gets entangled in these vices, it's not easy to break free. So they think they're being free when they're doing what they want to do, but next thing they know, they're actually a slave to their lower nature, and they're struggling to try to break free, and they can't do it. You see how the false notion of liberty, doing what we want to do instead of what we ought to do, actually leads to slavery. In this case, see, their master of these people is not another man, but it's their lower animal nature. That's the master, and he's always there with them. You see, you can't get rid of that master. He's always with them, and the only time he's happy is when he's being served. And the more he's served, the more vicious he becomes, the stronger vice he has on this. And when this happens, the person eventually starts behaving more like an animal than like a man. So it's like you said above, that it leads to chaos. It leads to chaos in the person's soul, okay? And then it leads to chaos in society. Because what's taking place in that person's soul, when it's taking place in the general population's soul, well, society itself becomes just really crazy, which is what we're seeing today in our own society, which again is a fruit of this false notion of liberty that is everywhere today. When you hear someone talk about liberty, they're talking about the false notion of liberty. Very rarely is someone talking about the true notion of liberty, which is, as we said, doing what we ought to do, following right reason, which is reason informed with God's law, which is reason in accord with God's law. That's true liberty. It's not simply doing what we want to do. That leads to tyranny, and that's pretty much where we are rapidly arriving at today in our society.
Yep, choosing sin does not make you free. We've talked about this before. You don't have the right to choose the wrong thing, and so when your will takes over, you do turn into an animal to a certain extent. I've worked with men who are addicted to impurity and drugs, and sometimes they will forego, and even women too, forego their children, their spouse, their job, everything to get their next fixed to whatever it is. And so they become, in a micro sense, totally engulfed in chaos. But then in a macro sense, we see that if society right now says that pornography is okay, then why isn't eventually child molestation okay? Why is homosexuality okay, but it's not okay to be with a child? Because their rules are not founded on right reason, and the Holy Father speaks about that kind of idea a little bit later. He's talking about civil society, so you make an excellent point. Let's continue. The Holy Father in Libertas number 8 is discussing the natural law and how it leads man to distinguish right from wrong, and this is a big issue. This is human reason and is dependent on the author of the natural law. So Pope Leo continues by explaining that, quote, authority is the one and only foundation of law. End of quote. The Pope then says, quote, but all this clearly cannot be found in man if, as his own supreme legislator, he is to be the rule of his own actions. It follows, therefore, that the law of nature is the same thing as the eternal law, implanted in rational creatures and inclining them to the right action and end, and can be nothing else but the eternal reason of God, the creator and ruler of all the world. End of quote.
Yeah, see, that's really beautiful. We've talked about this already a number of times, but the natural law is a participation in the eternal law of God. And the eternal law of God is basically the reason, God's eternal, immutable, unchangeable reason, his truth. And as his creatures, as his rational creatures, he gives us a participation, in a sense, in his own reason. So we have a participation in his law, and it's by virtue of this law that's engraven in man's reason that he knows right and wrong, right from wrong, and it's also what gives man a conscience, because conscience then alerts him when he's done something that he shouldn't do. We talked about abortion the last episode. We were saying how these ladies can be confused, and they really might think that it's not a baby, it's just tissue, and I should probably go ahead and have an abortion. They've been persuaded that this is the good for them to do, to have an abortion. But then we mentioned that after they make that wrong choice, even though they were confused at the time and maybe they didn't really intend to do something bad, after they make that bad choice, their conscience kicks in. See, their conscience knows they did something wrong, and that's what usually sends them at least part of the way off the rails, is dealing with what they did, which they now know what they did by virtue of their conscience.
Yep. Libertas 8 continues, quote, "To this rule of action and restraint of evil, God has vouchsafed to give special and most suitable aids for strengthening and ordering the human will. The first and most excellent of these is the power of his divine grace, whereby the mind can be enlightened and the will wholesomely invigorated, and moves to the constant pursuit of moral good, so that the use of our inborn liberty becomes at once less difficult and less dangerous." End of quote.
Yes. Okay. Now we're getting to an extrinsic thing that helps us to live according to right reason, and that helps to rectify the defects in our intellect and will. We said the intellect, the defect in the intellect, it can judge wrong, okay? The defect in the will, it can choose wrong. Well, one of the helps God gives us, and this is a supernatural act of God. This is not natural to man. It's a supernatural act. It's called actual grace. If you look in a catechism, one of the older ones, it'll tell you that actual grace does two things. It enlightens the mind, and it moves the will. So notice what it does. It enlightens the mind, the intellect, and it moves the will. So it addresses the defects. It enlightens the mind to what? It enlightens the mind to the truth. Because the intellect, let's say, is starting to judge wrong. Well, actual grace will enlighten to the truth. So that corrects the defect in the intellect. And then what does it do? It moves the will to the good. So what's the will, the defect in the will? The defect in the will, it's saying, I'm going to choose something other than what I ought to choose. Well, the actual grace, it moves the will in the right direction. So that's what he's talking about there. That's an extrinsic help to perfect our liberty. Remember, liberty is doing what we ought to do, not just what we want to do. So that's an extrinsic help that God gives us to enable us then to more easily do what we ought to do.
Okay, paragraph 9 just real generically talks about the natural and eternal law in society, and we'll get to that much more later, so we're going to skip ahead to number 10, where the Holy Father is explaining the application of these points as they relate to the civil authority. He says, quote, "From this it is manifest that the eternal law of God is the sole standard and rule of human liberty, not only in each individual man, but also in the community and civil society which men constitute when united. Therefore, the true liberty of human society does not consist in every man doing what he pleases, for this would simply end in turmoil and confusion and bring on the overthrow of the state, but rather in this, that through the injunctions of the civil law, all may more easily conform to the prescriptions of the eternal law." End of quote. There's a lot there, Rob.
See, boy, it's a lot, but that last sentence was beautiful. Notice what he said in that last sentence. The purpose of civil law. Now, this is another one of those extrinsic things that helps us to live according to right reason. He says the purpose of the civil law is to help man more easily live according to the eternal law of God. Another way to put it would be to say that the purpose of the civil law is to help men live according to right reason. or according to the natural law, because the natural law, where does it come from? It comes from the eternal law. So that's the purpose of civil law. It's supposed to reflect the objective moral law of God. It's supposed to forbid what God forbids. It's supposed to encourage what God encourages. And what does that do? It helps perfect our intellect. Our intellect is what looks at the truth. It's what looks at the teaching, okay? So it perfects it. It helps to rectify the potential defect in the intellect, which is that it judges wrong. So abortion, we keep coming back to this. What does the law say? The law says, have an abortion. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just fine. It tells them that's wrong. It tells them that something that's bad is actually okay. And so what happens? These ladies have an abortion, and it sends them off the rails. See, the law should say, no, you can't have an abortion. Now, some people might say, well, hold on a minute. That's going to result in all these ladies having abortions in back alleys. Well, that's their problem. If they're going to be so evil as to violate the law and have an abortion in the back alley, that's their problem. At least the innocent ones who didn't know better aren't led astray by a bad law. So again, civil law is supposed to reflect God's eternal moral law so that it enables man more easily to live according to his right reason. And again, and what else helps us to do that? It's the sanctions that are attached to that law. And those sanctions, like we said earlier, those sanctions then kind of appeal to the will, okay? The teaching appeals to the intellect. It tells the intellect what's right and what's wrong. But the sanctions, now the will starts getting a little involved here because the will doesn't want to be punished, you see? It doesn't want that bad thing to happen to it. So it's going to then be persuaded to choose the real good, because if it chooses the wrong good, it fears being punished. So it kind of persuades the will to choose what it ought to choose rather than what it just desires.
Sure.
That's
we've been
great.
Go ahead.
There.
Yep, it is. We've been talking, though, about how the will can choose a false good, but the intellect can almost choose a false truth. And you kind of mentioned an example of that when somebody says, well, if you outlaw abortion, then women will get abortions in back alleys. And that's kind of, that's totally false argument, too. They're saying, choose this evil or this evil. And you're never, ever in life set up that way. God's grace is sufficient. There's always a good way to choose. There's always the truth, the real truth. What happens, though, when sometimes these women are so confused and so pressured, they don't understand what's happening, that their intellect doesn't really know the true truth.
Absolutely.
Now, we've been talking...
That's the problem with putting truth and error on the same level.
Right.
That's actually what liberalism did initially. Initially in what we can call the old world order, which was Christendom. And Christendom, the laws of society were based on the laws of the gospel, okay, on the teachings of Revelation. Well, liberalism, when it first came about, it was trying to put truth and error on the same level by encouraging the toleration. First, it was just a toleration of these evil actions. Well, eventually what happened is the clear distinction between truth and error. It became blurry because truth and error then were put on the same level. And so that's why there's so much confusion today. And now it's actually going even further. Now the laws not only forbid what is bad, the laws not only today encourage what is, in Christendom the laws would forbid what was bad, okay, and it would encourage what was good, and then we had everything put on an equal level, and then it flipped the other direction. So now they're actually encouraging bad behavior and kind of punishing or discouraging good. So everything has done a 180. It's flipped around, and so again, that's why we have so much confusion today. And now today, people are so confused. You'll hear people say that they'll ask accusingly, do you think you have the truth? It's almost like it's so odd that someone would have the truth to these people. that, and it's all due to this confusion with laws, putting truth and error on the same level.
Absolutely. And I think, Rob, we'll have to end here this episode. Anybody who's following along and listening, we really appreciate it. If you'd like to email us, if you have any comments, you can, veritaspodcast@yahoo.com. We appreciate it. Rob, I'll talk to you later.
Okay, good talking to you. I look forward to next time.